Well, hey there. Welcome to Mosaic Community Church, where for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at the book of 1 Kings. Um, I don't know about you, but personally, I've found these past few weeks with this coronavirus to be something of an interesting social experiment, as globally we've been able to watch different nations and different governments all responding in different ways, but to pretty much exactly the same situation the world over. That's the thing with the global pandemic, and that is that all of us are dealing with more or less exactly the same challenges and issues, but in different places and in different ways. It's kind of like the perfect laboratory experiment in one sense. So, for example, as we're just watching the news and as we're looking at what's happening around us, there's a whole raft of questions that we're wrestling with at the moment. For example, should we be focusing predominantly on the health challenges and the saving of lives, or should we be focusing more on jobs and the economy and the saving of people's livelihoods? Should we be giving greater authority to governments to directly intervene and so limit our freedoms? Or should we be limiting our governments and so emphasising greater individual responsibility and freedom? Or again, should we seek to limit the number of deaths by enforcing a strict quarantining? Or do we accept a reasonable number of deaths in the pursuit of some kind of greater crowd immunity? Consequently, as you think through those questions, do you find yourself thankful for where you presently live, or else wishing that you were somewhere else and or under a different model of government? And lastly, of all the times and places in which to be alive, would you have picked this time and this place? Or would you have picked some other place and some other time? Well, I guess if you were to ask the people of Israel, the Old Testament people of God, when was the best moment and the best place for them in which to live? What was their golden period, the high point, if you like, of their national experience? I guess that most people within the Old Testament would have said that it was the 10th century BC. And not so much under King David, but probably more so under his son, who was King Solomon. And of course, some people might argue that it was David who laid the foundation for that golden age. But look, it was Solomon who inherited it, who built upon it, and who would ultimately take the kingdom to staggering new heights. So that it was under Solomon, or King Solomon, that all the promises which God had previously made to Abraham, right back in Genesis 12, were now being as fully realized as they ever would be within the Old Testament. So remember, the promise to Abraham was that God was going to give to him a land, and that he would create, or that he would make of him a great nation, and that he would be a blessing to the rest of the world. Well, by the time you get to Solomon, those promises have pretty much been as fully realized as they ever will be within the Old Testament. By the time you get to Solomon and the 10th century BC, Israel by now has become a great people. They're living in the promised land, and they've now become a blessing and a witness and a light to the nations around them. Furthermore, it's also under King Solomon that the promises which have been made to both Moses and Joshua are also being fully realized, as the nation was now experiencing rest from both their wilderness wanderings and also their enemies. So that under King Solomon, he was the only king under which the nation never had to go to war. And in fact, one of the biblical writers would put it this way when describing this situation and this time and this place in which the people of Israel were now living. He says in 1 Kings chapter 4, a little bit later on, that the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So there's the part of the promise to Abraham. As numerous as the sand on the seashore, they ate, they drank, and they were happy. As Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life, for he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River, from Tiphash to Gaza, and they had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. I mean, if ever you're going to pick a time in the Old Testament in which to live, then this would be it. I mean, apart from Genesis 1 and 2, obviously. But this is the ideal time, the best time which to be alive. I mean, you got peace, you got prosperity, there's security, you got a nation that is conscious of God and is following God. They're walking with God, and so it's a great time in which to be alive. However, as we do go into the Book of Kings, let me just give you 3 other things by way of introduction. The first one is that the books of 1 and 2 Kings highlight not only Israel's golden age, Old Testament history, but it also highlights, if you like, those events which would lead to its division, its downfall, and its eventual destruction. Firstly, at the hands of the Assyrians in terms of the northern kingdom of Israel, and then ultimately at the hands of the Babylonians in terms of the southern kingdom of Israel. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the books of 1 and 2 Kings are a very brief history. They cover over 400 years of Israel's history, but they managed to do it in just 50,000 words or less. And so that means that a lot of stuff gets left out. On the other hand, though, it also means that the Holy Spirit has been very selective in choosing those events from Israel's history and which God is wanting us to learn from. And then thirdly, for our purposes, what we're going to do is we're going to break the book of Kings into 6 parts, beginning today with chapters 1 through 4. Meaning that the best way to get the most out of these talks is to do some of your own work beforehand, and as much as possible, try and read up on some of the passages the week before. So they're the 3 things, just by way of introduction. However, let's start though with where the story begins, and that is not yet with King Solomon, but rather in the final days of King David, which you can see just there in 1 Kings chapter 1, in verses 1 to 4, the first 4 verses of the book of Kings, and it opens in this way with King David. That when King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers over him. And so his attendants said to him, let us look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him, so she can lie beside him, so that our Lord the king may keep warm. Then they searched throughout Israel for a beautiful young woman and found Abishag, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The woman was very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him, but the king had no sexual relations with her. Well, this woman probably has probably the worst job in the kingdom, I reckon. But anyway, that being so, look, if this were the opening scene of a movie, then you might imagine it with a single camera panning across to reveal this now weak and elderly King David, maybe being played by disheveled Nick Nolte. And you can almost imagine him clutching at his bed sheets and desperately trying to keep warm. And you can almost imagine, couldn't you, the dismay that here is David, King David, the athletic giant killer, who as a young man had defied an entire army of Philistines by saying to them that, look, you might come against me with sword and with spear and with javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel. He defied an entire army and stood up against this giant of a man, this Goliath. Later on, a man described by the Bible as being a man after God's own heart, and who would go from looking after simple sheep to ultimately becoming the greatest of all of Israel's kings, so that nearly every other king who would come after him would, in one way or another, be compared against him. And yet here he is now, this great King David, reduced, as it were, to this weak and trembling and old man who is unable to even leave his bed or keep himself warm. And yet, as someone else put it, this pathetic picture of a man whose name had once been synonymous with fearlessness and strength reveals the honest realism of the Bible. In other words, the Bible isn't going to glamorize it. It's not brushing over this stark reality that, yes, David had been a legend in his time. But the Bible also reminds us that, look, even the best of men are still only men at best, and that here we have David, who at the end of the day is still only a mere mortal like us, and who, despite all that he's achieved, all that he's acquired, still has to face the most common enemy of all of us, which is that of both old age and eventually even death itself. So that here is the final enemy whom David must face and who would eventually slay him. And so given that David is nearing his death, what is it that his now eldest son is attempting to do? Well, have a look at what immediately follows in verses 5 to 10 as we're told this. Now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, I will be king. And so he got horses and chariots ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never rebuked him by asking, why do you behave as you do? He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. That's important. Adonijah conferred with Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest, and they gave him their support. But Zadok the priest, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei and Ray, and David's special guard did not join Adonijah. Adonijah then sacrificed sheep, cattle, and fattened calves at the stone of Zoheleth near En-Rogel. He invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah, but he did not invite Nathan the prophet, or Benaiah, or the special guard, or his brother Solomon. Well, I remember a few years ago talking to an elderly gentleman from the church that I was attending at the time. And he was a godly man, a pillar in the church who had faithfully served for a number of years as an elder or a deacon. And I later learned from the pastor himself of how this same man had also been a wonderful friend and encouragement to him over many years. However, on this one particular morning, and just before church was about to start, this gentleman shared with me his greatest regret. And that is that in the many years that he had followed Jesus, the many years he'd been involved in church and serving in the church, he had in the process neglected his own sons. And it was now with great sadness as he told me of how none of them had grown up to follow Jesus. None of them were themselves professing Christians, despite their father. And I think the reason he had for telling me this was to say, in effect, that, look, don't think that just because you're following Jesus, that you can therefore somehow be passive towards your children and that they will therefore just simply work it out themselves. That despite the popular idea that Christianity and biblical truth is caught rather than taught, that is not entirely true. Rather, you need to do both. Yes, it needs to be modeled, but it also needs to be intentionally taught and practically imparted. We need to be intentional in terms of teaching our children and imparting biblical truth to them. So you'll notice in verse 6 how David had never rebuked or disciplined his son. He'd never asked him, look, why do you behave as you do? Verse 6. as far as we know, he'd never tried to teach him, rebuke him, correct him, train him to live rightly before God. And this, sad to say, seems to be one of the main failings of David as a father. Indeed, many of us as men today, namely that of passive and dysfunctional parenting, causing sociologists a number of years ago to begin referring to Australia itself as the land of the absent father, even in those homes in which there's a dad. Passive and dysfunctional parenting and absent fathers. This seems to have been one of David's weaknesses. Bear in mind that Adonijah is now David's eldest son. Why? Well, because Amnon, who had been David's eldest, we find out a couple of chapters earlier, had sexually abused and raped his half-sister. And yet David, when told about it, did absolutely nothing about it. Not as a father, not as the king, nothing. And so Absalom, who is David's second eldest, he therefore takes it upon himself to murder his own brother in order to avenge his sister, after which David then responds by having Absalom thrown out of the kingdom. Now, of course, David eventually relents. He allows Absalom to return, but only on this initial condition that Absalom is never ever to see his father again. He's never ever to come before David again. And so Absalom eventually responds by, well, he organizes what turns out to be an unsuccessful coup, trying to remove his father, and during which he is now killed by Joab, who had been one of David's most trusted leaders and one of David's closest friends, and incidentally, both the cousin of Absalom and the nephew of King David, which brings us to this present moment where, having now been demoted by King David for killing Absalom, Joab, remember, who is Absalom's cousin and David's nephew and David's friend, trusted leader, himself now aligns himself with Adonijah, who is David's third eldest son, and who himself has absolutely no problem whatsoever in now using the very same man who killed his own brother, as long as it advances his own ambitions for the throne. And so here is Adonijah, who cannot even wait now until his father is dead, but who is already making a dash for the throne, attempting to grab the kingdom for himself, and so declare himself to be king. I mean, forget about underbelly. I mean, the Bible makes underbelly look positively PG. I mean, this is some seriously dysfunctional family stuff that is happening here. And so, whilst David may have been a great and a heroic king and leader of God's people, unfortunately, he also had a history of paternal weakness towards his son, and which eventually shows up in each of them turning their backs upon God and breaking the very heart of David. And so, to summarize, if you like, the last 10 chapters which come before the book of 1 Kings, so the last 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, what we find is that David had been unable to rebuke Amnon, unable to discipline Absalom, and now unable to restrain Adonijah. And look, this here should be a lesson and a warning to every parent, and especially to those of us who are fathers. Sometimes it's easy to see which parents or which fathers are dropping the ball in terms of their children, and so we'll try to come alongside them and help them. But of equal or perhaps even greater concern are those blokes who outwardly seem to have it together. And so men like David, who are seen as great role models and leaders and examples within the church, but who secretly might be dropping the ball at home. Men who are busy with the ministry of the church, but failing in the ministry of the home. And if that's you this morning, or if that's you today, then I'd encourage you to do something about it now. Don't put it off until later, because these here are the most impressionable and formative years of your children's lives. And so therefore it warrants this question of who or what is the biggest influence in your child's life at this moment, and who or what are they being most influenced towards? If it's not you who is influencing them, then who and what? And what are they being influenced towards? If it is not the things of God. Well, long story short, Adonijah, according to verse 6, he might have had good looks and popularity. He may have even had the political and religious backing of some pretty big names. But unfortunately for him, it's going to take more than this to be the kind of king that God is looking for. So then, if Adonijah isn't going to be king, who and what is the kind of king whom God is looking for? In order to lead his people, to seek their greatest good and their peace, what kind of king is God looking for who can secure, as it were, the welfare and the security of his people so that they might enjoy God and so that they might live, as it were, as God's people in God's place, under God's blessing and in God's presence? Who or what kind of king is God looking for in order to do that? Well, have a look at chapter 2 in verses 1 to 4, where we're now told this. That when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires, namely to walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and his regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me, that if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. Well, who then is the king who will ultimately follow David to the throne? Well, it isn't Adonijah, but rather we find here it's to be Solomon. So that even as Adonijah himself puts it a little bit later on, Adonijah, these are his words, that the kingdom was mine and all of Israel looked to me as king, but things change and now the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. In other words, Solomon is the one whom God has chosen as king, and who, according to David now, is to not only listen to God's word and to know God's word, but he's also to walk in it and to do it. That's the kind of king whom God is looking for to lead his people. And this is the kind of king that Solomon is being called to be. And so little wonder then that as we come to these verses just a little bit, a short time later, in 1 Kings chapter 3, in verses 5 and following, we're told this, that at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said to him, look, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Solomon answered, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. Verse 7, now Lord my God is not just his father's God now, it's not just David's God, but my God. You have made your servant, that is me, king in place of my father David. But I'm only a little child and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you've chosen, a great people too numerous to count or number. Therefore, give to your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? And so a little bit later, chapter 4, verses 29 and 30, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than all the people of the East and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. Verse 31, his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. Verse 34, from all nations people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom. I love this. In chapter 3, Yahweh, the Lord, comes to Solomon to tell him, look, ask of me anything which you desire and I will give it to you. To which Solomon replies, give me wisdom. Give me wisdom. Give me a discerning heart so that I can govern this great people of yours and so that I can distinguish between right and wrong. Give me wisdom. And what does this wisdom look like? Well, in a word, it is God's wisdom. So if you cast your eyes quickly over chapters 3 and 4, you can see that this is to be a wisdom which enables him to be able to lead and to care and to govern the people of God. It's to be a wisdom which is based on a knowledge of creation and an understanding of how it is that God has ordered his world. It's to be a wisdom which enables and equips him to be able to teach others. And perhaps most importantly, it's to be a wisdom which enables him to administer justice and righteousness and so distinguish between right and wrong. It doesn't get any better than this, does it? Namely, to live as the people of God in God's presence and under the good and loving rule of a God who is leading his people through his chosen king and who has, as it were, the very wisdom and justice and righteousness of God himself. That's what characterizes him. And so little wonder then that even the nations come in order to listen to the wisdom of Israel's king. I mean, it sounds almost too good to be true. And it almost is. As Solomon, even at his very best, is still flawed. And as Solomon, even at his very best, can still only ever point us to the need for someone or something even greater than him. At the risk of giving away too much too soon, Solomon makes a wonderful start, but ultimately what we find as we continue through the book of Kings is that he will get lost in the journey, reminding us once more that even the very best of men are still only men at best. And so leaving us wondering, well, could it be that God will ultimately raise up an even better king than Solomon? Can he raise up a better king than even Solomon? And to which the New Testament will eventually answer with a resounding yes. And that this king's name is Jesus. It's Jesus. In fact, in speaking of himself in Matthew 12 and Luke 11, Jesus refers to those who came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. And then finishes by saying, and now something greater than Solomon is here. Solomon was only ever a pointer, if you like, to someone or something greater than himself. He foreshadows, if you like, he fulfills some of the promises of God, but he foreshadows, as it were, an even greater fulfillment, a fulfillment which only comes to be fully realized, as it were, in Jesus. That is who Solomon is ultimately pointing us towards. And so consequently, you might even say, just in closing, that the ultimate lesson, the ultimate application of these chapters just here is not simply that we ought to avoid the mistakes of David and Amnon and Absalom and Abijah, although that is true. Neither is it that we should avoid putting all of our hopes or trust in human kingdoms or mere men or or women for that matter, and who ultimately can only ever disappoint us. Rather, the ultimate lesson, the ultimate application of these chapters here, I take it, is that a truly wise person is one who is trusting in God, who is ultimately listening to him, and who is following Jesus as King. Let me say that again. The truly wise person, according to the Bible, is one who is trusting in God, listening to him, and following Jesus as King.